We're going to try and say a few words about the fourth sign. The fourth sign in John chapter 6 is the feeding of the 5,000. One of the things that we see in the beginning of this chapter is something that we see in other places, and kind of from the beginning of Jesus' ministry, is that when Jesus begins, and especially when his baptism, and then we know that Jesus goes to Jerusalem right in the beginning to cleanse the temple. Then he goes. It's in Galilee that his teaching begins. What we see immediately there is that the amount of people that come pretty quickly around Jesus, it doesn't take months or years for Jesus' fame to build up. It's something that's sometimes forgotten. We see movies of Jesus maybe with a few people or a little bit of crowd here and there, but actually the text is more specific here and other places where actually, in fact we have an example here, we have 5,000, actually specifically 5,000 men. That's the way sometimes crowds were counted. But if you add women and children, it could be around 15,000, 20,000, which represents quite a bit of people. In a relatively small population of those days. If you say 5,000 men, 15,000, even maybe 20,000 people, that represents a huge amount of people compared to the population. Because when you take people like places like Nazareth, Capernaum, it's not like big cities. Not even Jerusalem is such a big city. So the population, the percentage is pretty impressive to the population. In Matthew 4, at the end of the chapter, right before the Sermon on the Mount, it specifically says they came from everywhere, all over, and especially even from Syria, which is not even in Israel, all the way from the capital, Damas, a pretty large city. So we see here, in fact the text says there in Matthew 4 that his fame grew. Probably one of the reasons that Josephus, the historian, does mention in the Antiquity of the Jews in chapter 18 and later in 18 especially, it mentions Jesus even, and he says that we don't even think that he could be a man considering the things he did. That's what Josephus says, mentions him in his book 18 of the Jewish Antiquities. There's no reason why someone like Jesus would be famous, but still the fact that Josephus mentions that is significant for a historian like him, talking only about the main people of those days, the emperors and all of that. He also mentions actually John the Baptist, Josephus. So we see that in the beginning here in chapter 6, on the Sea of Galilee, and we're in Galilee here, the Lake of Capernaum, or the Sea of Tiberias, depending how you call it. There's different names. Where there's a lot of fish, and because that's where the fishermen come from. Capernaum is on the coast, on the western coast there. And you see that a large crowd was following him. And it's interesting because the word large and the word crowd, it's almost like repetitive, because the word crowd already means a lot. Large means a lot. It's like saying there's a huge, big crowd. If it's a crowd, there's already a lot of people. So that language indicates you already see there, and corresponds to what we have in Matthew chapter 4 at the end there, before the Sermon on the Mount. Large crowds. Where they're coming? Because of the healings. Obviously, Jesus heals not everyone, but he heals of all kinds of things that people have. It's just impressive to think of that. I see it as a unique event in the history of mankind. People don't see it like that maybe, but the coming of Jesus and what Jesus is able to do and what he teaches is really unique in the overall history of mankind. And it's unique. So a large crowd is following him because they saw the signs that he's doing on the sick. Obviously, people were sick. The medical conditions were not probably extraordinary back then. We know that. But even if that was the case today, people would still prefer to be healed like that than have to go through surgery or whatever you have to go through, take all kind of things. I mean, the healings of Jesus were instantaneous. They were complete. There was no doubt about it. They were not just something internal that you couldn't verify. There was all kinds of things. So that's pretty amazing. So here, and what we have here in John is the sign. And then we have, after that, another kind of teaching that Jesus gives about the meaning of that sign. That's very typical of John. There's a sign and then the meaning of the sign. A sign and what it actually means, okay? And like I said before, we have a contrast here, like usually in the book of John, between Moses and the Messiah. Moses and the Messiah. Moses who gave the law and the Messiah. There's a contrast. And we'll see that. And why is that the case? Because the religious leaders, and it's kind of normal when you think about it, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the teachers, are focused on Moses. They're focused on the Torah, which is the first 5 books of Moses, the law. That's the focus, really, of the teachings in the synagogue. It's the focus of the training of the scribes and the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. That's why they're called teachers of the law. And the Torah is considered the most important part of the Bible by the Jewish people still today. It's the foundation, the law. So that's what we have here. And so we're here at the Passover. So he's in Galilee. He's on the mountain. We're at the Passover feast. And we know what that is, the Passover and the remembrance of the deliverance of Egypt, how the blood of the lamb was on the doors, and how they were able to be freed from 400 years of slavery in the promises of God that God had promised the fathers. It was at hand, it was coming, and lifting up his eyes, then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" Okay. Well, of course, he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. So he wants to, what he's doing is he's teaching the apostles something by not necessarily revealing what he's going to do, but by asking him a question, to see how they're going to, what would be their reaction, what would be their way of doing that. And that's an important way of teaching. Sometimes instead of telling people, here's what the Bible says, or here's what you should do, sometimes it's better to ask a question. Well, what do you think? What would you do? Or what would this person do in this situation? Why do you think this? So questions very often are a good way for people to learn. And I think that by asking this question, Philip probably remembered better even what happened than if he didn't have the question. He probably would have remembered, I was thinking in my mind, how much money it would cost to feed all those people, and it's an interesting story here. So he says 200 denarii, which is about, 200 denarii is about 200 days of wage. And so 1 denarii would be 1 day of pay for 1 day of work. So you can count maybe you would count $8 an hour or $10 an hour, and you can see a little bit of God. But that's a lot of money. 200 days of wages, that's a lot of money to pay. It's almost a year. Not really, but it's a lot of money. So you say, wow, that's a lot of money. Worth of bread would not be enough, not even enough for each of them to get a little bit. So here we have maybe it's on purpose also in the teaching here, because we have the question of money. I mean, is it true that sometimes we feel that all depends on money? That if we had the money, I could do this. If I had the money, I could do that. But sometimes I think that we may be tempted to put so much emphasis on money that we are almost like, oh, I can't do a single thing if I don't have money. But there's a lot of things we can do that don't cost. So let's talk about that a little bit. What is it that we can do without $1? What is it that we can do to help people? We can pray. That doesn't cost anything. And we're accessing the one who owns everything, you know. God owns everything. That's a pretty good thing. It's better than to even talk to the banker because he owns everything. So we can pray. That doesn't cost. What else can we do? We can spend time. That's right. That's very valuable because sometimes you can give money to people. It doesn't replace the relationship. And very often that's what people need. Just to be talked to have a conversation, to be encouraged. And that there's no money that can buy that. Another thing we could do without money. Yes. I thought Charlie was going to say something. He just looked like he was going to answer. But a third thing we could do. We could spend time with people. We could. Yeah, we can love people, but we know because everything that's described about what love is, love is patient, love is not envious. All of these things have value. We don't see maybe like that. We say, okay, money is value, but what about all these qualities, all faith, hope, love? Is this value? Yeah, it has a lot of value in this world. And if you take all of that and you only have money, you're going to have problems in society, because really these are the foundation. The character of people, how they talk to each other, how they treat each other, has much more importance and value than all the money in the world. So I think maybe that's why this is here. I think this is also the lesson that we have, that Jesus is emphasizing and showing that, my kingdom, he says, and I'll show that later on, is not of this world. You want to make me a king. What would a king do? A king will provide all the food, a king will do this for you, a king will do that. But can a king actually change your character? Unless you decide, unless you do what you need to do. Can a king make peace, bring relationships between people to be better? I don't know. Yeah. Exactly.
Why you do what you do.
Yeah.
And what makes it.
Yeah.
What makes it valuable.
I think so.
Is the intent.
Yeah.
At the beginning of it.
Yeah.
That's not, and love's not there. The intent is not love.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting that he talks about money here. We don't have that much money. And then he begins the Sermon on the Mount about blessed are the poor. You can still consider you consider yourself blessed, whatever the circumstances. The financial or material circumstances. There's a blessing from God that we need to be able to see. His salvation is a blessing. It doesn't cost anything. His word is a blessing. We have it. We can study it. It's all of that. God says in Isaiah 55, come and eat, come and drink without money. And he's talking about his word. His word is free. All right. So 200 denarii. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, so we have here Andrew, the brother of Peter, there's a boy who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, okay? But what are they for so many? Now that's already a different thing from the idea of, it costs so much, 200 denarii. Already there is a positive here from the side of Andrew. What is the positive? What is this that's kind of like, I think, a positive attitude towards the situation? What would you say? Is Andrew's reaction positive or negative? Is it helpful or not helpful? What do you see?
You just kind of point out the obvious and, we got this.
Okay, and is that positive in your opinion or negative? Is there something positive about saying, well, here's what we have?
Sure, it's a glass half full idea.
Okay, yeah. We have this. Not much. And this is a very interesting idea because it seems to me that it goes back to the idea of the seed that Jesus talks about so much, where you plant the seed and God makes it grow. It's so small. In a seed, potentially you could feed millions of people in one seed, which is incredible when you think about it, that it has so much potential. It can grow and it can feed so many people. So here, I think there's something that I think is biblical, is that God can take something small that we give to him or we do for someone and can make it increase, can make it big. And he says, I sowed, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. Sometimes in our Christian life, we want to do a lot, but we think we need to have a lot. You know, you had two people say, I would help orphans, I would do this if I was a millionaire. Yeah, well, you could start small. You could start giving $5, or you could start doing this or that, or you could stop praying. You could start doing something with what you have. And I think that's the idea. And this is an interesting idea, because the idea would be here, it seems to me, that if you do with what is small, God can make it grow. Did Jesus not say that he who has been entrusted in the small things will be given what? Bigger ones, bigger things, bigger responsibilities. If we're faithful in the small ones, then we can be faithful in the big ones. So I think that's an interesting concept. So Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was much grass in the place, so the men sat down. Men, he says, about 5,000 in number. So in the ancient world, very often, in order to simplify things, crowds were counted by men, but also because men were more often here or there, because women would be working at home or with children. So it's also that reality. But probably there's, I would say, at least 10 or 15,000 people there. That are there actually. So, you know, more than 5,000. That's just a small number. Yeah. Then he distributes them to those who were seated, and the fish as much as they wanted. And they had eaten their fill. He told his disciples, gather up the leftover, that nothing may be lost. And they gathered up 12 baskets. The word basket here is the same word that's used in the book of Acts when Paul is having to hide, you know, at some point, and he's being delivered and sent out. He's put into a basket. That's the same word. These baskets, you could put a whole person in there. They're not small baskets, huh? There's a big. These are big baskets to put a whole person. Imagine all the bread and all the fish that's left, okay? And so when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who is coming to the world. Let's just say that as far as the 5,000 here that are mentioned, this is mentioned also in Matthew, Mark, Luke. Okay? But also, the other thing is that John only mentions one multiplication, but these other Gospels mention two. One with 5,000, one with 4,000. However, it doesn't mean that he only did two. He could have done more. Because even John will say at the end of his gospel, there's many, many, many things that he did more. So we're not necessarily to have to restrict ourselves to exactly two. This is just one here, and we know that in the other gospels there's two. Well, possibly that he did more often than that, because, you know, when people came to him for healing like that, they didn't carry necessarily their food with them. Now, William Barclay, who is the professor of New Testament in Manchester, he has a good series of commentaries on New Testament, but he has a funny explanation of this, because Barclay was kind of like suspicious about miracles, like many of the Bible exegetes, you know, in the 20th century, following the German liberal people. Barclay says, well, this is easy to understand. You know, they had brought their sandwiches. You know, they had brought their sandwiches. So when Jesus started praying, they knew it was time to eat those sandwiches. So everybody knew that this was going to happen. They brought their sandwiches. You know, that's kind of weird interpretation, just to avoid the miracle. And it kind of does that quite a bit. It's sad because, yeah, good, interesting information that he gives historically and all. But there, when it comes to the supernatural, the miracle, suddenly you know, it's not even there. I mean, so that anti-supernatural bias is very common among the 20th century, I would say, exegesis of the Bible, the miracles of Jesus, the miracles. Let's try to rewrite the Bible, taking out all the miracles, is problematic because it makes no sense. You know, you write the Gospel of John like this, you take out all these miracles. What is left? Because you have the miracle and you have miracle teaching, you take all of that out, you probably have 2 chapters left. Not much. So that's a very interesting way of looking at it. Oh, of course, but it's interesting how the modern mind functions when it goes and reading things like that, because you would think, what's the problem? What's the reason for trying to explain a miracle non-miraculously? I mean, see, by definition, it's a miracle or sign. Then it means you have the supernatural here. Why does it have to be all natural? Why do you take away that idea, of God being able to do these things? Of course, that comes from the scientific mind. That comes from rationality. That comes from all kinds of other things. Yeah. Yeah.
There's different numbers.
Yeah.
Different perspectives.
Right.
Things that
Yeah.
showed up 3 different times.
That's true. That's right. Yeah. That's true.
Same thing 3 times.
Exactly, and especially this is written from the perspective of a witness. This is not just a story made up. John will say himself that the one who writes is a witness, of these things. So that's, that's interesting. Now here's what we come here. 2 things that we have here that kind of come together is, first of all, the statement that this is the prophet that was to come into the world. Now, what is that? This is the prophet that was to come into the world. This is the prophet, of course, that we find in Deuteronomy 18, where God had said to Moses, there will come a prophet greater than you, Moses says there will come a prophet greater than I, and the people will have to listen to him. Of course, that prophet is the Messiah. He brings teachings from God that are revelations from God that have authority, just like Moses had. And here, I think again we see a contrast between Moses and the Messiah. That contrast here. So you have the idea of the prophet, and then right after that you have the idea of the king and the kingship. So perceiving they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountains by himself. All right, by himself. So now there is an idea here that some people have, and it's possible, I don't know, is that possibly even the apostles themselves were tempted to go along that route. And it's not surprising so much because we see them often, the apostles, they see Jesus' rule, Jesus' reign as political, as, this material, physical, political idea of the kingship of the Messiah. We see that with them. It's possible that they kind of went along with the crowd because Jesus actually basically leaves them. And later on in the conversation, when Jesus speaks, Jesus returns to the crowds, here's the apostles again. And then they're there, and it seems that the apostles are almost ready to leave, to give up Jesus. Says, are you going to go away also? So there's a real crisis there at this point for the apostles. It's not the only time. There's a crisis for them. Are we going to continue following him or not? Because their expectation of a political ruler was very strong in Israel. In fact, is still very strong. That is still something very, very common. The idea that Jesus is going to come and actually be a ruler, in a very physical, political way in Israel is very common still today. But I think that if we read carefully the New Testament, the Gospels first of all, and then the epistles, even the book of Revelation, we begin to have another picture. Let's look at John 18, what Jesus talks to with Pilate, discussing with Pilate about his kingship or kingdom. When you say kingship, kingdom, it's the same thing. Matthew 18. This is what happens when Jesus is confronted with Pilate, who is the governor of Rome here. So, verse 33, Pilate entered his headquarters and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now you see immediately the question here. Are you the king of the Jews? So that was what had been said about him from very early on. It's not just that people wanted him king, they began to proclaim him as king. And when he enters Jerusalem sitting on a donkey, he is proclaimed, even in the vision of Zechariah the prophet, as the king of Israel entering into Jerusalem. So are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered, do you say this of your own accord, or did others say to you about me? So what he wants to do is he wants to know what do you think, Pilate? What's your thinking? You know, he wants Pilate to express that. He says, am I a Jew? That's an interesting reaction. Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? And Jesus answered, and here's the answer of Jesus. He says, what have you done? And here's what Jesus goes back to this question, are you the king? You know? Are you the king of the Jews? That's the important thing. What have you done? Well, he's done nothing. The problem is not that he's done anything. The problem is that he is being presented by the people and by what he does as the king, as the ruler of Israel. And that's a problem for them, for the rulers. Well, he says, my kingdom, my rule, my kingship, is not of this world. Wow. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from the world. And so Pilate says to him, so you are king? Here's what he says. Here's the answer of Jesus. You say that, and I am king. Notice that. I am king. This is an important response from Jesus. It's pretty clear that he is king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. And Pilate said to him, what is truth? Here's an interesting concept, because when Jesus says, I am king, what do you think Pilate is expecting? If anybody comes before Pilate and says, I am king, what do you think, as the governor of Rome, as a non-believer, what does he expect when somebody says, I am king? What does Pilate see in his mind when he hears that? What does he see? Well, that's right. He sees a ruler, he sees a palace, he sees armies, he sees a nation, he sees all of that. But Jesus says, my kingdom is not of the world. He says, are you king? He says, yes, I am king. And then immediately after saying, I am king, what does Jesus talk about? I was born for a purpose. I came into this world to bear witness to the truth. Now think of that. So this means, what does this mean? There is a connection between the kingship of Jesus and his teaching. Jesus is not just a king, he's a teacher. Now, some kings are kings, they're rulers, but they're not necessarily teachers. They don't necessarily bring any truth, to the world. But Jesus is a prophet, Jesus is a teacher, and he is a king. So his kingship has to do, or his rule has to do, with what he's teaching. It doesn't have to do with the armies of Rome, with how many armies there are, with how much money he has, with his palace, with a crown on his head, with Caesar, with all of that. Because nobody could be king in the Roman Empire without Caesar at least agreeing for it. Even Herod was put there by Caesar. The governor was put there by Caesar. Everybody in the known world that had any kind of rule, a senator or a king, was there because Caesar said you can be there. So that's where, but Jesus shows that his rule has to, something is different. It has to do with truth. And so what does it mean? It's easy to understand, I think. That the rule of Jesus, or the reign of Jesus on earth, or even in Israel, is brought about by his teachings. And when people listen to his teachings and they follow him, in that sense, Jesus is king. It's a kingship that depends on people's choice to follow him. There are not many kings like that. In fact, the way I understand it, there's no. As far as the history of mankind, there's not one king or one ruler in the world where you actually choose that ruler.